The dust of Crécy had barely settled when France found itself face to face with a new era. Philip VI, the king who had launched the first great confrontations of the 100 Years' War, passed away with wounds that went far beyond the battlefield. His death did not close a chapter. It only exposed how fragile the kingdom had become. Onto this unsteady throne stepped his son, Jean II, known to history as Jean the Good. He inherited the crown not in triumph, but in the echo of a disaster that still haunted the nobility. The banners of Valois fluttered above Paris, but the air was heavy with unease. Merchants whispered about collapsing trade routes. Soldiers grumbled about empty coffers. In the countryside, the ordinary people spoke Philip VI's name only to blame him for the misery left behind. Jean II understood the unspoken expectation pressed upon him. He had to erase the memory of defeat. He had to restore dignity to a monarchy whose authority now cracked like weathered stone. And above all, he had to do what his father could not: confront England with strength instead of hesitation. But the kingdom he ruled was no longer the France of old. The war had carved scars across its fields and fractured the loyalties of its great houses. Local lords grew bolder, questioning royal authority as if the crown were just another weakened fortress. Factions whispered in the halls of Paris, each believing they alone could save the realm. Even within the royal court, ambitions stirred behind courteous smiles. Yet Jean II pressed forward, determined to rebuild an army worthy of France's former glory. He raised taxes, tightened control over rebellious nobles, and summoned knights from across the realm. The kingdom might be wounded, but he believed it could still stand tall. What Jean II did not know was that the storm ahead would not test his crown. It would test his very freedom. If you want to continue this journey into the rise and fall of kings, remember to like the video, follow the series, and subscribe to the channel for the next chapter. Jean II entered the throne with a determination that bordered on defiance. While France attempted to recover from the earlier blow of Crécy, the new king refused to let the kingdom sink into a posture of fear. He inspected training grounds personally, ordered a stricter chain of command within the royal army, and pushed his captains to adopt clearer structures of discipline. He believed that the chaos of previous battles had come not from a lack of bravery, but from the absence of order. If France was to survive, its forces needed unity more than ever. At the same time, Jean II understood that a war was not won only with swords. He worked to tighten royal authority, reinforcing laws that had grown lax during years of political strain. He called councils, issued decrees aimed at limiting the independence of powerful nobles, and demanded loyalty with an intensity that surprised even those long accustomed to royal pressure. The message was unmistakable. The crown would no longer tolerate wavering allegiance. France needed a single voice. Yet across the sea, Edward III did not remain idle. The English king recognized that hesitation in Paris offered him opportunities too valuable to ignore. He expanded alliances through calculated diplomacy, building relationships with regions and courts that stood ready to challenge French authority. In several duchies, discontented lords found England far more appealing than their own crown. Edward encouraged this sentiment, extending promises, money, and protection. He intended to surround France not only with armies, but with doubts. His military strategy also intensified. Instead of a single catastrophic invasion, Edward favored pressure from multiple fronts, forcing France to divide its energy. English ships prowled the coastlines, disrupting trade and creating fear among merchants who relied on steady commerce for survival. Raids struck regions that had previously felt distant from the war. Villagers woke to the sight of unfamiliar banners and realized that no part of the kingdom was beyond reach. Jean II attempted to respond with resolve. He expanded recruitment, called on knights to gather under his banner, and urged the country to stand firm under the Valois line. But each action revealed another layer of the kingdom's internal fragility. Some lords were slow to answer the summons. Others promised support yet withheld resources. And many citizens, exhausted by years of conflict, questioned whether the struggle should continue at all. Still, the king pressed forward with a single conviction. If France retreated now, the entire realm would lose its identity and strength. He believed that a renewed display of power on the battlefield was the only way to silence the growing whispers questioning his authority. Neither king was willing to yield. The war, which had begun as a dispute over succession, now evolved into a contest of endurance and pride. France and England inched closer to another decisive clash, one that would push both kingdoms to their limits. What neither ruler could foresee was how drastically this next confrontation would alter the course of history. Before the French court could stabilize itself under Jean II, a new force emerged to shatter any illusion of safety. Edward of Woodstock, later known across Europe as the Black Prince, stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone born to command. He was young, but not inexperienced. He had studied war under his father's eye, observed the discipline of English formations, and absorbed every lesson the victories of the previous years had offered. Now, he was ready to carve his own legacy. Unlike many princes who fought from the safety of the rear, Edward rode at the front. Armor darkened by constant use and battles fought under harsh suns, soldiers followed him not merely out of duty, but out of admiration. He spoke little, yet every order came with a clarity that made even hardened captains obey without question. He moved with speed, struck without hesitation, and retreated only when strategy demanded it. To many English troops, he seemed to channel the storm itself. His campaigns began in the southwest, a region of France that had long balanced between rival loyalties. Edward gave them no chance to remain undecided. He launched a series of raids that stretched across fertile lands, timing his movements with such precision that French defenders were always one step behind. Wheat fields that had fed entire regions burned under English torches. Vineyards that had stood for generations collapsed into scorched ruins. Villages vanished overnight, leaving behind nothing but smoke drifting over blackened earth. These actions were not blind destruction, they were deliberate. Edward sought to break the economic strength of the region, to pressure the French crown from within by forcing suffering upon the territories that still supported the Valois. Each raid sent refugees fleeing northward, carrying with them tales of devastation. What had begun as isolated attacks soon became a wave of fear sweeping through the countryside. Cities that had once felt distant from war now heard English hoofbeats approaching. Bells rang desperately as citizens scrambled to gather possessions. Many towns surrendered before a single arrow was fired, choosing humiliation over annihilation. Others resisted and paid for their bravery with total ruin. Everywhere the Black Prince went, the message was unspoken but unmistakable. England had unleashed a warrior who understood both strategy and terror. Back in Paris, the court of Jean II felt the shock deeply. Reports arrived daily, each more alarming than the last. The king found himself forced into decisions made not from strength, but from urgency. Resources shifted constantly as he tried to plug gaps across the kingdom. Commanders argued. Noble families panicked. The center of authority could no longer pretend it controlled the rhythm of the war. Jean II realized that the conflict had entered a new phase. It was no longer a measured struggle between two crowns, but a contest shaped by a prince whose presence alone changed the balance. And as Edward of Woodstock continued his advance, France braced itself for the inevitable confrontation that would determine whether the Valois could still protect their people from the storm that now bore down upon them. The road to Poitiers unfolded under a gray September sky, as if the land itself sensed the weight of the confrontation drawing near. From the moment Jean II ordered the full muster of the French nobility, the kingdom moved with unusual clarity. Messengers galloped day and night, summoning lords who had long hesitated, urging them to ride under the royal banner for what many believed would be the deciding test of their generation. It was not simply a call to arms, it was a call to reclaim a fractured national pride. Jean II rode at the center of this expanding host, driven by a resolve that had hardened during years of humiliation. The scars of Crécy still burned through the memory of the realm, and every setback had been laid at the feet of the Valois crown. Now, with the Black Prince cutting deep into French territory, Jean felt the pressure of history pressing against his shoulders. Victory at Poitiers could silence doubts that had pursued his dynasty since the beginning of the war. Across the countryside, survivors of English raids described the approaching enemy with bitter fear. Yet the English force was no longer the swift predator that had first entered France. Laden with plunder, slowed by days of constant movement, and increasingly anxious as rations dwindled, the army of the Black Prince was becoming vulnerable. Scouts returned each night with warnings that the French were closing the gap. The chase was narrowing into a corridor from which escape seemed less likely with each passing hour. Still, the English marched with determination. The Black Prince was no stranger to danger, but even he sensed how precarious his situation had become. The land around Poitiers offered both opportunity and risk, with rolling ground that could favor defense but little margin for error. He urged his captains to stay alert, to avoid overconfidence, and to read the land with care. For Jean II, Poitiers was not merely another waypoint on a military campaign. It was the stage for vindication. He believed that if he could confront the English here, face to face, the tide of the war could turn. And so the great French host surged forward, driven by wounded pride and the hope of rewriting the story that had haunted them for years. Dawn broke over the fields near Poitiers with a deceptive calm, a quiet so fragile that even the wind seemed afraid to breathe. Beneath this stillness, the French host prepared for a confrontation they believed would redeem years of frustration and loss. Jean II positioned himself at the heart of the army, surrounded by ranks of armored knights whose banners flickered nervously in the morning light. He had resolved that today would be a day of unshakable courage. Yet courage alone could not alter what was about to unfold. The first charge of the French cavalry surged forward with a roar that rolled across the landscape. Hooves thundered, metal clattered, and the battlefield came alive with the fury of an entire nation seeking restitution. But what the French encountered was not a scattered enemy caught off guard. The English stood behind makeshift defenses of stakes and natural rises in the terrain, their archers already prepared with taut strings glinting like lines of fate. As the French advanced, a sudden hail of arrows darkened the sky. The impact was devastating. Horses reared and collapsed, riders fell in tangled heaps, and the front ranks dissolved under the relentless storm of shafts. Instead of regrouping, the cavalry pressed forward again, driven by pride and confusion, only to meet the same brutal result. The battlefield became a maze of chaos. Commands were shouted but lost in the din. Reinforcements arrived late or in the wrong order, turning the royal strategy into a chain of missteps that magnified each other with cruel precision. Jean II watched as the disaster unfolded. Determined not to retreat, he led his remaining men forward on foot, pushing through the wreckage of the earlier charges. Around him, loyal knights formed a tight circle, defending their king with the desperation of men who understood that the fate of a kingdom now hinged on their blades. They clashed with the English line in a fierce melee that churned the earth beneath them. Steel met steel in violent arcs, and the shouts of men drowned out any lingering doubt. But the English counterattack closed like an iron trap. The Black Prince had timed his movement with calculated patience, sending fresh troops against an exhausted enemy. As the French ranks thinned, the ring of defenders around Jean II shrank to a fragile knot. His son, Philip, fought near him, witnessing the collapse of their hopes with a horror that would follow him for the rest of his life. Jean II refused to yield until the very last moment. Surrounded, wounded, and with no path to safety, he continued to strike until he could no longer lift his sword. When English soldiers finally overwhelmed the defenders, they recognized the significance of the figure before them. Here, on this broken field, the King of France was taken prisoner. The sight of Jean II lowering his weapon marked more than the end of a battle. It marked the collapse of a crown. News of Jean II in chains traveled across Europe with the speed of thunder. Courts from Avignon to Prague whispered in disbelief. Merchants paused their dealings. Nobles reconsidered alliances, and common folk prayed in silence. A king captured on the field of battle was not merely a humiliation. It was a fracture in the natural order, a signal that the balance of power had shifted in ways no one fully understood. In London, the English crown understood the magnitude of its advantage. The Black Prince had not just defeated the French, he had seized the very symbol of their sovereignty. For Edward III, the opportunity was too great to waste. He demanded a ransom so immense that even the wealthiest kingdoms would have trembled before it. Gold, land, hostages, concessions. It amounted to a price far beyond what France could reasonably pay. Yet the Valois had no choice but to negotiate. The burden of this ransom soon cascaded downward like a merciless avalanche. To meet even a portion of the demands, taxes rose to unprecedented levels. Levies were placed on crops, trade, and everyday goods. Entire villages found themselves unable to cope with the sudden strain. Winters grew harsher, not because the weather had changed, but because larders were empty and families had nothing left to give. The people who once viewed the monarchy as a paternal force now wondered why their suffering had become the currency of royal redemption. The economic collapse loosened the fragile bonds that held the country together. Bankruptcy loomed over the treasury. Officials argued over how to extract more from a population already on its knees. Meanwhile, the English negotiators pressed relentlessly, aware that the longer Jean II remained a prisoner, the more desperate France would become. Within this turmoil, murmurs of dissent began to stir. Local uprisings flickered in rural regions, fueled by anger, hunger, and the belief that the Valois had failed in their sacred duty. In towns and parishes, citizens questioned whether a dynasty that could not protect its own king deserved loyalty at all. The ransom did more than drain coffers. It drained trust. And in the hollow silence left behind, something darker and more dangerous began to take shape. Across the kingdom, every road seemed to lead toward ruin. With Jean II held in London, France found itself governed not by unity, but by fear. The throne stood physically intact in Paris, yet spiritually vacant. The king was absent, his heir overwhelmed, and the aristocracy circling like wolves sensing weakness. For the first time in generations, the idea of France as a single nation felt fragile, almost imaginary. In the countryside, unrest grew like a wildfire no one could contain. Harvests were disrupted by constant troop movements. Armies marched through fields without discipline, consuming what little the villagers had left. Bands of desperate peasants formed groups of resistance, but their fury was scattered and without leadership. Many did not know whom they were rebelling against. They only knew they were starving, taxed beyond endurance, and abandoned by those who claimed to rule in the name of the crown. The nobles, instead of providing stability, turned inward and clawed at each other for influence. Castles that once housed proud families now echoed with suspicion and secret negotiations. Some lords openly questioned the future of the Valois, while others considered aligning with England if it meant protecting their estates. Every oath that had once bound the realm together began to sound like an empty ritual repeated out of habit rather than conviction. Foreign armies exploited the chaos. English garrisons fortified captured towns. Mercenaries roamed the borders unchecked, selling their allegiance to the highest bidder. Villagers fled toward the cities, seeking safety that no longer existed. Paris itself strained under the weight of refugees, shortages, and the quiet dread that the war had broken something fundamental within the soul of the kingdom. Amid this unraveling world, symbols lost their meaning. The royal fleur-de-lis no longer inspired reverence. People saw it on banners, on gates, on coins, and wondered whether it still represented hope. Many could not shake the feeling that their nation was dissolving in front of them, not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow and painful erosion. As word spread that negotiations for the king's ransom dragged on with no relief in sight, despair settled over the land. It was not the loud, explosive despair of battle, but the quiet, suffocating kind that seeped into daily life. France appeared leaderless, divided, and exhausted. The war, once a matter of pride, now felt like a chain dragging the country into an abyss. Imagine a muddy village road after a storm. A torn banner lies half-soaked in the dirt, its once bright lilies dulled and smeared. No one comes to lift it. No one claims it. It lies there like the kingdom itself, waiting for someone to decide whether it can still be saved. If you want to follow this journey into the darkest chapters of medieval Europe, make sure to follow and subscribe for the next episode.